Hey guys, so today we're going to look at perfect competition, which is one of our four market structures that you're going to be studying as part of your economics course. So every good belongs to a market structure. So the first one we're going to look at is perfect competition. It's deemed to be one of the easier ones by students that I have taught. We then have imperfect competition, monopoly, which is market structure you're familiar with, because of the game. So the object of the board game Monopoly is to eventually own everything, so have complete ownership or a majority control over a particular, on the game obviously is over the whole of the board. And then the final one's oligopoly. And then we'll also look at, in terms of monopoly, we'll be looking at a little bit of price discrimination as well. There's four market structures, only these four, but price discrimination comes under monopoly. So we'll be kind of looking at that as a subheading under monopoly. Just again, I want to highlight the fact that these are really kind of basic theories, and we know that when it comes down to a theory, there's obviously, we could probably pick out goods and services in the economy that don't really fit into any of these four, okay? But we do still study them, and what we'll see is that there's an awful lot of goods that do apply to these four market structures. Okay, just before we begin, every market structure we look at kind of follows the same layout, okay? So we will first define the type of market, so I give you examples of products in those markets. We will look at the assumptions or characteristics, because obviously markets aren't as clear anymore as the four markets that we're going to study. Some products might belong in one or more market. So we're just going to go through the basic assumptions or characteristics of each market, and what you'll find is some of them are very similar. We will draw the graph in the short run, and I'm going to talk you through specs, which is kind of a little mnemonic that I use to help us remember how we describe the actual market structure. Then we will learn to draw the graph in the long run. In one particular case, there is no short and long run, so it's the one graph for both. And then finally, we look at other key information. So for example, if we look at monopoly, we might be just looking a little bit more into the barriers to entry and the different types of barriers to entry. Okay, so let's begin. Firms in perfect competition produce identical homogeneous goods, okay? So homogeneous being the key word here in this definition. Homogeneous means identical. There are many sellers who are the price takers, and that's the second key part. They're the price takers to a large number of buyers. So when I say price takers, we're going to talk about the industry and how the industry sets the price. They're homogeneous goods, so there's no difference between one good and the next. And an example of a product would be the lovely Irish favourite or Irish staple food of potatoes. Okay, so when we talk about identical goods, we're not talking about organic and non-organic, just normal potatoes. My potatoes will be really no different than the farmer down the roads. So I can't decide to set a higher price than the farmer down the road, and we're going to see why that is. Okay, so our first assumption, the first assumption has to do with the actual product. So the firm produces a homogeneous product, and this means that the product of one producer cannot be distinguished from that of another. The second assumption, a very large number of sellers and a very large number of buyers in the market. Now, you can split this in two, so I'm just going to put a little note here. You can split this assumption in two and use it as two assumptions, because if you were asked this in an exam, you could be asked for outline the assumptions of perfect competition. It could be a 20-mark question, which means you need 4. So if you're really stuck in an exam, you can split this in two. So there are a very large number of sellers in the market. There are a very large number of buyers in the market. So no buyer or seller can influence the market price or output, as neither have a large share of the market output. So for example, like I was giving you there earlier, if I was selling potatoes, and let's say for example another farmer Joe down the road was selling potatoes, if I felt my potatoes were better, I couldn't set a higher price for them, because what would happen is people would just decide, well, there's really no difference between Miss Heavy's potatoes and Farmer Joe's potatoes. So I'll just go with the cheaper options. That's why we say that the industry sets the price. And we see this a lot with agricultural produce, and you see, farmers going on strike and whatnot because they feel that the industry price is too low. We also see that no one buyer can influence the market price or output. So what I mean by that is, if I was a consumer and I felt that the industry had set the price too high for potatoes, well, my decision to not purchase potatoes anymore is not going to have a huge impact on the industry, because of course there's loads of people in the country that buy potatoes. Okay, so you heard me mention earlier that the industry sets the price or the market sets the price. So I'm just going to explain what I mean by that. The firm's price is determined by the market interaction of supply and demand. So here you can see I've put in demand and supply, and we can see that we remember from our study of demand and supply that where these two intersect or cross over is our equilibrium price and quantity. So if I just draw a broken line across there, that's my equilibrium price, and I can just draw my equilibrium quantity there, so that's P1, and we can call this Q1. Okay, but it's actually from there that the firm's price is set. So you can see if I just go across here, draw my broken line across, and I'm just going to draw my demand curve for the firm. So the demand curve for the firm is exactly horizontal. So remember, we call that in elasticity, it's an elastic demand curve. Okay, perfectly elastic demand curve. So remember, we said if I were to put a little I could actually make an E shape out of that. So, and that's perfectly elastic demand. So at that, the firm sets that price, which is by the market, and then depending where the rest of the curve crosses is where we'll get our quantity. So I'm going to explain that in a second. So the industry, depending on demand and supply, sets this price P1, and as a result, that's where we establish the firm's demand. And I'm just going to label that axis as well. What we know is that demand is always equal to average revenue. So that is just the revenue generated by the number of units sold. Okay, and the whole way across all of our market structures, we would say that demand equals average revenue. So just get used to labeling this the demand curve like so. Okay, so just to explain that a little bit more, we talked about it being perfectly elastic, so we can see that here. If you remember, when we looked at elasticity, if I just draw another line here, it makes an E shape. So that's how we know elastic, okay? But remember, when we talked about perfectly elastic before, we said that if the price increased, demand would just completely drop to zero. Okay, so if a firm tries to charge a higher price than the market's price, its sales would just be zero, as consumers would just go elsewhere. Okay, therefore the firm is said to be the price taker. So that was from our first assumption or a definition, that the firm is the price taker. Now, what happens if the price goes below the market price? Well, if I decided to try to kind of cheat the rest of the people out in the market, out of their share of the market, and reduce my price, chances are I'm going to be reducing that below cost. Okay, so we know that if a firm produces below cost for too long of a period of time, they'll actually just not be able to survive in the industry. They won't be able to break even. So break even is when your revenue is equal to your cost, so you're not really making a profit. Okay, so for the third assumption then, perfect knowledge exists. So all firms have full knowledge of the profits being made by other firms in the industry. And the reason for that is, if you think about agriculture in Ireland, most farmers know the costs of production, and they know then how much they can kind of estimate how much another farmer is making by their knowledge of maybe how much they're producing and whatnot, because there's no secrecy in the industry. They know what the cost of production are. They all know the exact same price. They're getting the exact same price, so they have an idea of the profits. And finally, there's no barriers to entry. Firms are free to join and leave the industry as they wish. We'll talk about barriers to entry later, particularly when we look at oligopoly and monopoly. There are barriers to entry. The final one, and this is a really important one because it applies to almost all of the market structures. The firm's aim is to maximise profits. Profit maximisation occurs where MC is equal to MR, and I'm going to show you that on the graph now. Profit maximisation is where your marginal cost equals your marginal revenue. I cannot stress how important this point is. If we were in school now, I'd bring in bags of M&Ms and, just to try and get it to stick in your mind, and I'll definitely do it next year for you when we're back in school. But yeah, so like profit maximisation occurs where MC is equal to MR. Marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. So at that point, the firm don't want to produce any more. And also there's no point in producing less. If they produce more, their marginal cost would be higher than marginal revenue. If they produce less, their marginal revenue is higher than marginal cost, which means they could produce one extra unit. And when they're equal, that's the maximum efficiency that they are at. So just a couple of points to remember, and this is the last slide that we're going to talk about in part 1. So a few points to remember. MC is equal to MR. I've just explained that. When profit is maximised. The revenue you make selling the extra output is equal to the cost of making the extra output. So you're not going to want to produce more or produce any more extra output, because if you produce more, your marginal costs will be higher than your marginal revenue. If you produce less, your marginal revenue is higher than your marginal costs and you're not being efficient. Okay, so at the point MC is equal to MR is where you're going to maximise the amount of profit you can make. If we see that AR is equal to AC, that's normal profits are being made. Okay, so sometimes students ask me when I go through the graphs with them, well, why is that firm staying in the industry if they're not making supernormal profit? Supernormal profits is where your average revenue is much, much, much greater than your average cost. And supernormal profits we'll see in the short run for perfect competition, but we'll also see in all of the market structures, in particular for monopoly. Supernormal profit exists even in the long run. Okay, but when we look at AR is equal to AC, it's just normal profits. It's not crazy really high profit, it's just normal profits are being made. So the selling price of 1 unit is equal to the cost of making 1 unit. I often say normal profit is enough to keep that business in the industry. Okay, in part 2 I'm going to go through describing the short run perfect competition curve.